Today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Cultural Evolution. The reality is, if you look at these things, one of the reality is that cultures never stay the same. They always change. People like to think, well, this is traditional. We've always done it this way. But reality is that life has changed. And as life changes, a lot of times traditions change as well. Um, I had a conversation with Wilson. Wilson and I used to have some pretty good conversations. He was trying to teach me about the Dene culture, and I was trying to resolve some of the questions that I had about these things. And one of the questions I asked him was, well, you talk about these traditions as if they've always been that way, but it seems to me like a lot of them follow the Christian idea. So I'm just wondering if maybe some of your traditions haven't changed over time to fit better with the Christian ideal, so that they'll be more acceptable to first the Spanish and then of course the Americans. And he said, that's a possibility, but he didn't think so. He thought that they had always been that way, and he may be right. I'm not a Dene cultural historian, so I don't really know. It's kind of interesting, though. It's an interesting concept, and so most cultures have evolved. Of course, um, once upon a time there were no cars, so the culture of driving, the culture of moving down a road, is probably different now than it was back in the horse and buggy days. Um, why do Americans drive on the right side of the road, and the English and the Japanese drive on the left side of the road? It's a good question. It's a question that people don't ask very often. Okay, so cultural evolution. Excuse me. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. For example, when I was living in Sailly, Sailly is at 7,000 feet. It's fairly dry, not very green. I didn't think it was very green. Of course, we have all those pinon trees, pinon pines. But where I live, it's really green. I mean, it's really, really, really green. My lawn looks like a golf course. It's so green. I'm surrounded by cornfields, and the corn right now is about 8 or 9 feet tall. So I'm surrounded by green, a little bit more than what you guys see. Evidently, the wind blows where you guys are, so the trees aren't very tall. You've got those lodgepole pines over by the lake that are pretty tall, but see, all of the trees around here are that tall. So it's a little bit different. So it would be logical for people who lived in this area to have it. The environment here is different than it is in Sailly, especially Chinle, excuse me, Chinle. It's down in the valley. It's kind of dusty, kind of deserty. Not a whole lot of, there's no green there at all. There is some, not a whole lot. Anyway, so this kid lives. This is actually Guatemala, and he's looking out over the mountains. I was actually right behind where he is. He was sitting in a tree. Anyway, that's so it really all depends. It really all depends on who you are and where you are. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. There are no large indigenous mammals on the Hawaiian Islands. Therefore, the Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions. These are the largest animals and butterflies and Hawaiian geese, known as nene. Uh, This is the Hama Hama Nuka Nuka Apawa'a. It's the it's the state fish of Hawaii. I had a shirt that had this on it, Hama Hama Nuka Nuka Apawa'a, and somebody else, somebody who had been stationed in Hawaii, came up to me, and of course I'd never pronounced the name before, and he goes, "Oh, Hama Hama Nuka Nuka Apawa'a," and I thought it was so cool the way he just said it that I decided I would learn how to say it as well. Anyway, these are the large animals. In order to catch a Hawaiian monk seal or a humpback whale, of course, you need to a ship of some kind in order to, or a boat of some kind, in order to go hunt them. And other than that, that's about it. I mean, there's just nothing big. There's no moose. There's no buffalo on the Hawaiian Islands. There's just something that can either swim in or fly in. The Hawaiians do not have any hunting traditions because there's nothing to hunt. The Kung of the Kalahari live in an environment surrounded by large animals and derive much of their caloric intake by hunting them. The Kung have a strong hunting tradition. Antelopes, wildebeests, zebras, elephants, even elephants, hippopotami are in the area. So they get most of their calories from hunting these animals. On Hawaii, of course, this is about the only animal, maybe the monk seal. You could catch a monk seal from time to time, but they mostly just fish. And of course, there's not much of a hunting tradition when it comes to fish. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. A good example would be Japan. The Japanese don't really have, there's no cattle. Well, there are cattle. They've been brought over there. But before there were no cattle, there's no small rodents like the squirrel. So they eat mostly seafood. The Japanese do. There's a lot of fishermen in Japan. Where I grew up in Indiana, it used to be an oak forest, and there's of course walnut and hickory in the area, and lots of squirrels. So people could live off of hunting squirrels, shooting them out of their trees. And squirrels are kind of strange. They like to challenge you. So it's not like they do hide, but of course a lot of times they just sit there on the limb and make fun of you. According to Gilmore in 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. And you can imagine that this is one of those areas. This is Mongolia. And as you can see, there's no green. These are animals that have been brought in. And these are milk cows, certainly. That's a Guernsey, and this is, it's not quite a Holstein. Well, maybe it is. Anyway, they're milk cows. Nothing that you would want to eat because you need their milk. Places where large game is hunted. People have traditions of masculinity. Places where risky deep-sea fishing is performed. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go out on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckees greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by young men engaging in frequent violent drunken melees with knives and clubs. And so the masculinity is important. The fact that one male fights another male in order to gain superiority. But it's not that way all over the world. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish because fish are readily available in the shallow lagoons. You can just go in there and pretty much scoop them out. There's virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes the lifestyle. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met with the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. How in the world did they do it with just 168 soldiers? Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal cause of Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor, horses, and also that the fact that the smallpox had decimated the Incans. As a matter of fact, Atahualpa was not the emperor when the Spanish landed. It was his uncle, I believe, and his uncle died of smallpox, and Atahualpa took over. Didn't have a lot of, there wasn't a lot of cohesiveness in the Incan Empire at that time, and it was fairly disjointed. This is Sacsayhuaman. That's where they are. I was there in 2003. This is just above Cusco. Cusco is where Cusco is a ancient Incan city. This is about 8,000, 9,000 feet above sea level. They thought it was a fortress, but the reality is that there's nothing behind there. It's just a flat plain. I'm not exactly sure why the Spaniards were attacking it. Anyway, they defeated the Incans at Sacsayhuaman outside of Cusco. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, wheat, barley, peas, and lentils all grew there. They had lots of domestic livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, and cows, not to mention horses. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements. And because of that, they were able to create steel and to create armor and to become very aggressive. The domestication of various animals allowed the people in the Eurasian area to live in close proximity with animals for thousands of years. Because of this proximity, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between the Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans. All of these diseases came from animals, and then they were transmitted to humans. Measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza. Influenza comes from pigs. I think all of these actually come from pigs. Pigs have a very similar immune system to humans. So if you live with your pigs, then potentially you will trade your diseases to the pig. The pigs will get into the pig, and the pig will the disease will mutate, and then it comes back to the human. This is the reason why influenza looks different every year, because it comes out of usually comes out of China, comes out of Asia anyway, because they fertilize their fields with human waste, and since they do that, and the pigs go out and they root in the fields, they're passing these diseases back and forth from humans to their pigs. And then the pigs live in close proximity to the humans. Humans will get that disease. That's the way influenza works. We're still trying to figure out where COVID came from, whether COVID came from a wild animal or whether it came from a domesticated animal. But this is normally the way that the viruses work. So the more that you live in close proximity to your livestock, the more likely that you will pass the diseases back and forth. When I was living in Germany, my neighbor, the person that the person that owned my house, he lived in a house that was on top of his barn. So there was the barn was the bottom floor, the second floor was his house, and the third floor was his house. So the kitchen was right over where the pigs were. So they had a hole in the floor, and what they would do if they had anything to throw away, they would just throw it down this hole to the pigs. So the humans were constantly, scraping their plates down into the muck down there. It wasn't that messy, and it didn't smell that bad actually. But well, it did have an odor to it. But that's the way they did things. They lived with their pigs. And actually, in the wintertime, when the wind blew and it got really cold, the heat from the animals actually helped heat the house, as interesting as that is. So they live with their livestock, and they've been doing this for an extended length of time, and that's one of the reasons why Europeans came over to the Americas with such sophisticated diseases, because these viruses all developed from the livestock, the mutations in the livestock, and the rest is a really ugly history. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions, but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. The white clay people of Montana talk of the 600 lodges being reduced to 60 when smallpox first struck the area. Burial, which they normally did in rock crevices up in the mountains, and there weren't that many mountains around them. This is in the Central Plains of Montana. But they used to bury their dead in crevices in the rocks. People died off so rapidly that they had to bury their dead in trees, in the limbs of trees. And there aren't that many trees around there either. So it was really kind of an ugly, ugly time. They refer to it as the time they had to bury people in trees. And of course they have their own Algonquian and Siouan language, how they say this, but that's what they're talking about. China, okay, so we're done talking about that. And all I want you to understand is that the environment really dictates how how the culture evolves and how it matures or how it changes over time. Diseases. Diseases from Europe just devastated the Americas. And every year, diseases come out of China because of the way that they raise their crops. Okay, so now we're going to talk about China. A lot of diseases come out of China. The COVID-19 came out of China. Influenza comes out of China every year, or at least Asia. So China's kind of an interesting place. China, it's a fairly large country, and it's up against the Pacific Ocean. Actually, that's the Sea of China, China Sea, right here. This is the China Sea. This is the Pacific Ocean. It's in Eastern Asia. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat, where it's fairly temperate. They have winter. It's kind of hot in the summertime, but this is northern China right here. It's less populated than southern China. Southern China is just packed with people. This is where it's nice and warm. That may be one of the reasons why people live down here. This is Korea right here. That country right there is Korea. This is Japan. This is Taiwan, if you know about Taiwan. And this is Luzon, the northern island of the Philippines. So in the north, in the pink area or salmon-colored area here, they grow wheat. In the south, where it is warmer and more humid, they grow and eat rice. Because there is a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. Now, when I lived in Indiana, we grew wheat. We grew wheat and soybeans. The wheat would eat up the nutrients in the soil, and then the soybeans would put it back in the soil. We used to grow wheat 2 years in a row, then we would grow soybeans, then we would grow wheat for 2 years, and then soybeans. And we did that because we could make more money off of wheat. So that's what we did. Anyway, and Indiana, of course, is a temperate environment. Rice is cultivated in paddies, plots of standing water, and this is what a rice paddy looks like. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. And of course, they have to plant each one of these rice plants. And that's fairly tedious. They walk through sorry, lightning just struck near me. They have to walk through the water and plant the rice. And if they try to do it when there's no water, then the rice plant will die. So there has to be standing water in the rice paddy when they plant the rice. And so whole families would get out there sticking, rice plants in the paddy, in the mud. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. Wheat farmer does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive. They can just broadcast the wheat seed out. They can just throw it out there and it grows. It's great stuff. Looking at the people from northern and southern China, researchers have discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They saw themselves as part of a network. They were tolerant of nepotism. They engaged in more holistic reasoning. Let me show you a YouTube video. And the reason we're going to watch this video is because this is from China. This is how the Chinese see the difference between northern Chinese and southern Chinese.
美女，能给我你电话号码吗？美女，能给我你的电话号码吗？
She's from the north.
喝呀喝呀喝呀！干杯 ！Come on, pussy！
亲爱的，要不要来一点？
可是我喝一点点就会很晕嘞。
就来一点点啦。啊！ 这是我特意为你做的。
哇塞，你好厉害呀，亲爱的！
哎，怎样？怎样？哎
，What's your problem？ 别打了！
哎，走！我要抱歉，哎，你What's your problem？ 哎，你开始。
好恐怖，我不敢看。
亲爱的，我先不要看了这个。
这有什么好怕？抢我包！好讨厌！ 哇塞，你看这个男的长得很帅，有没有？
最爱你的人是我，你怎么舍得我？许多故事有伤心的理由，这一次我的爱情。
Come on, pussy.
When we're okay, remember this is for a Chinese audience, so they didn't really understand what they were saying. Anyway, okay, so you can see the difference between people that live in the north and people that live in the south. People that live in the north are a lot more aggressive. It's a lot less crowded in the north than it is in the south. So people feel more individualistic. In the south, where Shanghai is, Nanking, I don't think they call it Nanking anymore. They don't call it Shanghai anymore either. But in the south, it's so crowded that people are far more collectivistic. So people grow up with different attitudes for things. Evoked culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biologically encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites. Attractive people are healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. When there is little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate: intelligence, kindness, sense of humor. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned such planting practices by observation. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years, and they are both nomadic cattle herders and eat the same foodstuffs, and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are very different. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle and live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds and rely on the meat. The Dinka maintain tribal relationships with the families they live near. The Nuer maintain kinship based on the male line. The Nuer are a larger and more militaristic tribe. The Nuer maintain costly, inflexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Wait a second. Okay. Okay, this guy is, oh, I'm sorry. This guy's a Dinka. The one on the top is a Dinka. I've lost my arrow. Sorry. Let me do this again so I can get my arrow. This guy's the Dinka and this guy's the Nuer. As you can see, they both use scarification to identify themselves, but the scarification is totally different. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. Individual variability exists among members of a species on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates. Their traits have a hereditary basis. Fast-running antelope may have an advantage in outrunning predators. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain them. These are pronghorn sheep. They're actually a member of the sheep family. Or are they antelope? Maybe they are antelope. A slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in a time of drought, when the food sources are limited, they're more likely to survive than the fast-running antelope. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from generation to generation. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others. One of them is religions. There seem to be religions in lots of different cultures. The Dene have their culture, have their religion. The Hopi, the Pueblos have their religion. New religions are popping up from time to time. The Native American Church is a good example of a need that was seen. Evidently, it is an old idea, but it kind of died out. And then as the American Indian tribes were being colonized at the end of the 19th century, there came a need for this again, and it came out of the second time it came out in the Comanche tribe, who had been defeated in the 1870s under Quanah Parker, and that's where the religion came back. And political structures are the same way. Political structures, especially today, for the longest time it was a conflict between communism and democracy. Things are changing. The political structure is changing, but there have always seemed to have been political structures. Copying errors are very common with cultural ideas. Copying errors, mutations are rare among genes, but they're very common in cultural ideas. This is what the bathing suit looked like in 1875, in 1890, in 1900. As you can see, there are copying errors as we are going along. 1925, we got a little bit more risque, and 1927. The last issue of Sports Illustrated is the swimsuit issue. It's really kind of interesting. As things are changing, if you looked at the swimsuit issue 10, 20, 30 years ago, and I've been getting Sports Illustrated for an extended length of time, if you look at the swimsuit issues from 30 years ago, they were fairly risque, and the swimsuits they were showing were fairly risque. And then as the Me Too movement started, the feminist movement started, the swimming suits changed. The female swimming suits changed. There for a while, it was almost like looking at Playboy if you looked at a Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue 20 or 30 years ago. The one I told my wife always gets upset every time I get the swimsuit issue. She gets upset because she thinks it looks fairly pornographic, but it's, that's one way of looking at it, I guess. So she kind of got angry. She gets angry at me every time the Sports Illustrated issue comes out, like I'm the one that took the pictures. But the last one that came out is there's hardly any, not nearly as much skin being shown as any other time. Once upon a time, only the most beautiful, most buxom women, models, made the swimsuit issue. This time there are Megan Thee Stallion is one of the people in the magazine. Naomi Osaka is in there. There are some plus-sized women, and certainly everyone is fairly covered. Kathy Ireland and who's that lady that just had a baby with Verlander? I can't think of her name. Anyway, some very attractive women, of course. But only the most attractive women made the swimsuit issue. And now, I'm not saying the women in there aren't attractive. What I'm saying is they had to be tall and slender before, and fairly buxom, and now it's not nearly that way. There's a transgender person in the latest swimsuit issue. Kind of interesting. Anyway, swimsuits are one way of looking at things. Genes pass slowly, genes pass vertically from parent to offspring. Culture passes horizontally from one person to anyone they come in contact with. Cultural evolution can be very rapid, whereas actual mutation of genes is very, very slow. While genes have to be adaptive to be repeated, cultural ideas do not have to be adaptive. Even maladaptive ideas can spread, as with the headhunters of New Guinea, when half of them died due to a degenerative disease passed from diseased victims. And it was porous brains. It was mad cow's disease. I'm trying to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or maybe it's Jacob-Creutzfeldt disease. Anyway, it had to do with spongiform bacteria. They caused holes in the brain, 8 holes in your brain, and half of the headhunters died because that was part of their culture, was eating the brains of your enemies. Dynamic social impact theory posits that individuals come to influence each other, and they do so primarily in terms of how often the individuals interact, which ultimately leads to clusters of like-minded people who are separated by geography, cultures in other words. Norms develop among those who communicate with each other regularly. This is Zac Efron, and I can't remember why I put this picture in here, but that's from a movie. I don't remember. In 2007, Callum and Harton followed a group of students for a year. The researchers set a baseline by discovering the students' attitudes before they became students. The researchers discovered that the students that lived in the same dorms and ate in the same dining halls maintained similar attitudes, no matter what attitudes they had before coming to school. The students began building microcultures within their living units. Cultures emerge when people communicate. Now, this is really kind of interesting because I'm right now I'm having a debate with a friend of mine. I graduated from college 50 years ago. And at my college, there were 75% of the people lived in fraternities, and 25% were independents. They lived in the dormitories. So if you and the independents also lived off campus. So one of the things that happened was there was one large dorm on campus. So the people at that dorm kind of got together, and they decided that the traditions of the school were toxic and needed to be changed, and that's what we did. We represented 25% of the student body, and the fraternities fought it because fraternities are all about tradition and whatnot. So there was this culture war going on our campus. This is in 1967. There was a lot going on all over the world. There were cultural wars going on in the United States. The Vietnam War was taking place. Kids were trying to change the trajectory of the United States and the things that we believed. And all of these things were taking place around the world, and it was happening in our college at the same time. Now, so this is the debate. On September 11th, I am going to my class reunion in Indiana, and I will tell you what happens. It should be interesting. One of the differences between the fraternities and the dormitories, the independents, was that all but one of the fraternities were segregated. And of course, that meant that all of the minorities, almost all the minorities, I guess there were Asians in one fraternity. Yeah, there were Asians. and there was a Asian Indian in another fraternity. But all the African Americans were in the independent dorms. None of them. There was one that was integrated. Anyway, that's like 10 different fraternities, and they're all segregated. So that's that became a huge sticking point as far as I was concerned. I just thought it was appalling that Indiana, which has fought in the Civil War against slavery, here they had this. They accepted these ideas of segregation. That segregation was acceptable, and I was appalled, and all of my black friends were fairly appalled. Anyway, I'll tell you how all this turns out. I'm sure that they will, if we even mention it, they will pretend that they knew nothing about the fact that their fraternity was segregated. Um, so the whole point is, and of course, this became a movement at the school. Uh, Cultures emerge when people communicate. So here we were eating together, we were living in the same building. Most of the African American students had white roommates. I can't think of any that didn't. Uh, yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of interesting. We'll see what happens. Contemporary legends are simply fictional stories that are told in modern societies as if they are true. Booby-trapped Halloween candy is one such contemporary legend. There have only been 80 documented cases since 1959 of people putting razor blades or poisoning candy for children. Colonies of released alligators live in the sewers of New York City. The reality is that New York is too cold for alligators to survive in the winter. The sewers are full of toxic waste that would not support reptilian life. Therefore, this is a myth, along with the Halloween candy. HIV-infected needles are being left in coin return slots to contaminate an unsuspecting person. There has never been a recorded case of anyone contracting HIV from being stuck by a needle in a coin return slot. Researchers have found that rumors and legends are more likely to spread when they can evoke shared emotional reaction among people. The characters from fiction that are the most memorable are the ones that evoke emotion in us. And of course, there's a lot of rumors going on right now about the vaccine. We can't get everybody to get the vaccine. Makes no sense whatsoever. We've done this before. We did it with polio. We did it with smallpox, and now that we could stop COVID from killing any more people, people are refusing to take the vaccine. There are some states that it's like a third of the people have taken the vaccine, and 2/3 of the state haven't, as stupid as that sounds. And a lot of this has to do with politics, and a lot of it has to do with stories that are spread and are repeated. The fact that there was fraud in the last election, of course, is one of these contemporary legends. Emotional ideas are more likely to spread through a culture than our unemotional ones. This is why our news is full of sensational stories of rescues, disasters, and wrecks rather than mundane things that happen every day. This is an earthquake hit. This is an Italian city, and as you can see, this is what it looked like before the earthquake hit, and this is what it looked like afterwards. You can see this side of the building. There's the church tower, and you can see all the buildings are flat. The Fulani of Africa believe that the world was created from a drop of milk, and this is what it looks like when the world becomes created by a drop of milk. It's in that hat somewhere. Japanese mythology states that the world was created from brine dripping from the tip of the jewel spear of heaven, and this is what it looked like. That's the jewel spear of heaven, and there is the drop right there. Judeo-Christian beliefs state that God created heavens and earth in 6 days. The kinds of stories that are especially likely to persist in our memories are ones that contain a few minimally counterintuitive ideas. Minimally counterintuitive means that they are statements that are surprising and unusual in the sense that they violate our expectations but are not too outlandish, like this boat. Why would you do that? Do you think that structure is very seaworthy? It looks unique, but I'm not exactly sure I'd want to ride on it. Does globalization mean that we are destined to all become citizens of a homogeneous world culture? Probably not. The trend toward globalization is simultaneously paralleled by an opposing trend toward increasing tribalism. Ethnically diverse cities such as New York, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney are microcosms of the world at large in many ways. Each has many distinct ethnic enclaves coexisting within their boundaries. Thus, there are trends toward cultural heterogeneity globally, while there is a trend toward cultural homogeneity at the local level. Cultures that are individualistic include a variety of practices and customs that encourage individuals to place their own personal goals ahead of those of the collective and to consider how they are distinct from others. And this is according to Trandis in 1989. Tracking of children at school. That doesn't have anything to do with Harry Potter, but we do track children at school. We have above average students and we have below average students, and we watch these kids. When I was in school, of course, I started school in 1955. When I started school, is that right? Yeah, I started school in 1955. When I started school, we had bluebirds, redbirds, and yellowbirds. And if you were a bluebird, it meant that you read better than the redbird. And if you were a redbird, it meant that you'd read better than the yellowbird. And if you were a yellowbird, it meant that you didn't read very well. And we tracked these kids, and pretty much I can remember being in the first grade and reading out of the Bluebird book. Um, it followed the kids throughout school. So tracking children in school has been around for an extended length of time. Workers being given meritocratic pay at the office, meritocracy. So if you do good work, then you get more pay. That's the idea. College-age children being encouraged to move out of their parents' homes. And this is unique. This is the way individualistic cultures work. We create a hierarchy, so we want our children to be above average. Like the children of Lake Wobegon, they're all above average. And we want to make more money because we're better at things. So that's why CEOs deserve millions of dollars in payments, in wages. Because we're an individualistic society, despite what culture somebody comes from, we are still pushing students to leave home when they're old enough, because that's the individualistic way of doing things. Employees being given individual cubicles, as weird as that is. All these people can hear each other talking, and this is very disturbing. I don't know if you've ever been in a cubicle situation like this, but it's awfully disturbing. People choosing to put their elderly relatives in retirement homes, and that's an individualistic way of doing things. Collectivistic cultures include many cultural practices, institutions, and customs that encourage individuals to place more emphasis on collective goals, the goals of one's in-groups. Children sleeping with their parents. Classes of school children being promoted together to the next grade regardless of the performance of some individual students. Marriages being arranged by parents. This is something very common in collectivistic cultures. Companies compensating their employees on the basis of how long they have been employed rather than whether they do good work or not. Extended families living under one roof. Many surveys reveal that Americans feel more financially pressed than before, even though real incomes have been rising and time pressures have increased as two-career families have become common. This is Putnam in 2000 speculates that individualism has increased 10%. Now the question is whether COVID has really changed any of this. And I guess we won't know until people start doing research on what's happening. But COVID's not over with yet. We have the Delta variant. We're looking at the Lambda variant coming out of Chile. It may be worse than the Delta variant, but we're hoping it doesn't spread worldwide. And I can assure you that if we don't get a hold of this thing, if we don't if people don't get vaccinated, then what's going to happen is the Lambda variant is not going to be the only variant, where it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Maybe that's the zombie apocalypse that people were talking about. Suburbanization is another reason for increased individualism in the United States, according to Putnam, and this factor is also at 10%. Suburbanization results in people spending more time in their cars and in their homes and less time with friends and neighbors. And this is one of the things that the pandemic has caused. People are buying, the housing market is just insane right now. People want to, before they were spending a lot of time at work, they were spending a lot of time in their cars. They weren't spending any time at home, but now there are so many people that are working from home, like me. They want to make sure that it's really comfortable. Before, they didn't spend that much time at home. They worked a lot. They had to be there. It took them, a time to get from work to home. They went out with their friends. Now it's really hard to do that. So culture and society is changing because of COVID-19, because of the pandemic. The second largest culprit to increased individualism among Americans at 25% is electronic entertainment, especially television, which leads people to isolate themselves and engage in more passive forms of entertainment. But I'll tell you, the video games, the kids playing video games, by golly, you can't pull those kids off of those video games. They are fascinated by video games. My grandson, he's only 9 years old. This kid watches other people play video games. I don't know. I don't recognize the fascination with watching somebody else play a video game. But that's what he does. He'll do it for hours. He'll watch a video game. He'll watch other people play a video game. He's not even playing it himself. The only time he plays video games is when he doesn't have any internet service, when he's driving somewhere in the car. Really weird. Really weird. It's changing everything. Everything is changing. Putnam in 2000 discovered that the younger generation even watch television differently from the way their parents and grandparents do, as they are more likely to turn the TV on even if there is nothing in particular that they have in mind to watch. The older generations are more likely to watch TV only when there is a particular show that they want to see. And this is true, I guess, with Hulu and Amazon Plus, and I can't think of Netflix. You can watch anything you want, anytime you want. And this is the way people are watching television now. You don't have to wait for Tuesday nights NCIS or Monday nights Bob Hart's Abishola, or when was Big Bang on? Thursday nights? You don't have to do that anymore. You can watch anything anytime you want. You can watch all the shows on CBS if you want. You can binge watch shows. Approximately half of the variance behind the increasing individualism rests with the different lifestyles between younger and older generations. And of course, all of these things are going to change the workplace. All of these things are going to change the future. One of the most remarkable findings regarding cultural change is that people seem to be getting smarter. On average, across all cultures for which there is longitudinal data, people in the current generation have higher IQ scores than those from earlier generations. And one of the reasons is because of Google. You can find any information that you want. This doesn't mean that they're smarter. Well, what this means is when they have a question, they can find the answer. In the old days, if you wanted to find the answer, if you didn't, you needed an encyclopedia to look it up, and sometimes you couldn't find it. But yeah, with Google, you can look up just about anything. Now, in the beginning, when the internet first started and Wikipedia first started, there was a problem. And the problem was that Wikipedia wasn't very accurate. So people were getting things wrong. And this was a problem. But now Wikipedia is more controlled, I believe. Only select people can put things on Wikipedia. You have to sign up to be able to put things on Wikipedia, to correct things on Wikipedia. So it's far more accurate now than it has been in the past. When I first started allowing people to use the internet for their research sources, Wikipedia was one thing I would not allow them to do because there was just too much misinformation on Wikipedia. The trend of intelligence rising has been dubbed the Flynn Effect after the researcher who first identified it, and that is this guy right here. I think his first name's Jeffrey Flynn. And as you can see, he's quite the unique looking individual. He first discovered this in 1987, and then he found out that also in 1994 that the numbers were going up. A review of changes in IQ scores in 14 nations revealed that the average increase in IQ was between 5 and 25 points per generation, which is a lot of points. That can be the difference between an average intelligence and a genius. According to Healy in 1990, most TV programming communicates at about a fourth grade vocabulary level. Of men born in 1890, only 27% had more than an eighth grade education, and only 9% had any schooling after high school. This was my grandfather. My grandfather only went through the third grade. Yet my grandfather invented, how can I say this? One of the things that he invented was the backhoe, but he was such a stingy person that he wouldn't sell it to anybody. So during World War II, they took it from him because they needed it for the war effort. So they took it from him and they took it overseas. And when they started using it in England, and if you look it up, if you look up in Google, it will tell you that some guy in England invented it in 1947. No, he didn't. He found it. My grandfather invented it in the 1930s. He was a heavy equipment operator. He owned a road building crew, a road building company, and they built roads all over Indiana. And one of the things he invented was the backhoe, but he didn't patent it. The silly old fellow. He also invented banking curves. He knew that the faster that cars went, and like I said, he only had a third grade education, but he read a lot. And nothing went fast enough to need a curve to be banked except for trains. And trains were always falling off the track because they were trying to go too fast around a curve. So one of the things he did, he was hired by a railroad to repair a curve because a train had gone off and it had torn up the rails. So what he did, he banked it, and he banked the railroad curve so that they could go faster around that curve, and people noticed that that was happening. Then he was also working on the Indianapolis 500. He took his road building crew out to the Indianapolis. Actually, it was in Speedway. It was in a swamp. The Indianapolis 500 is actually built in a swamp, and the reason that it's built in a swamp is because that the land was cheap out there. So they were building the Speedway, and he banked his curve. And the first guy that drove on his curve kept telling the people, hey, this is a lot faster. I can go a lot faster. Of course, back then, they weren't really going that fast. Cars weren't really going that fast, but they could go fast. He could go at full speed around a banked curve. And after that, they banked all the curves. And that's one of the reasons why the Indianapolis Speedway is such a famous roadway, oval, is because it was the fastest roadway or speedway or racetrack in the world because they were banking the curves. And nobody thought of that before because there was no need for it. Nothing went fast enough that you needed to bank the curve. But my grandfather was the first one to do it. Lost his business because all of his horses died. He had all these uh, Belgian horses to work the roads, and they all died of glanders, so he lost them all. Anyway, not important. He was a really goofy guy. He wouldn't patent anything, and he had all these ideas, and nobody would listen to him because he just had a third grade education, and then he would do it anyway. People would take his ideas, as strange as that is. I'm still looking for a picture of his backhoe. If I can find a picture of his backhoe from the 1930s, we'll publish it. But I'm looking at all the old pictures and I haven't found it yet. He did all this stuff in secret. There were people that flew. He wasn't one of them, of course, but there were people that flew airplanes before the Wright brothers, but they didn't talk about it. It was a secret, that kind of stuff. Silly. In 2012, the percentage of Americans over 25 who had more than eighth grade education was approximately 94%. 58% had some schooling after high school, and approximately 11% had graduate degrees. And of course, just in 1890, only 27% had more than an eighth grade education. The other thing about my grandfather, and the thing that's kind of irritating, yeah, he was smart. He didn't think you needed to learn anything from a book. You could learn by reading, is what he thought. So my dad, when my dad was in the eighth grade, he told him, "That's it. You need to drop out of school." My dad was actually the youngest one in the family. There were six of them, and when the other five had hit the eighth grade, they all quit school and started working, or got married and well, not in the eighth grade, but they stayed at home and they cooked and did all and cleaned and whatnot. But my dad said, no, I want to go to school. So his father wouldn't allow that to happen unless he paid him room and board. So my dad went to work in a grocery store and actually got him through the Depression because old food that they had to throw away, he'd take it home and they'd cook it up right away, and it was, I guess they survived anyway. Yeah, he had to pay room and board to my grandfather, and at one point he didn't have enough rent to pay his father, so my uncle actually lent him the money, and of course my father was eternally grateful for his brother chipping in and helping him stay in school, and he graduated from high school. It's the first person in that family to graduate from high school in my dad's side of the family. And he believed in education, so he tried to educate all of his kids. And here I am. I don't wear a red outfit like that. Mine's blue, but black and blue. That doesn't sound good. Mine looks more like this, but I don't look like that, that's for sure. Anyway, okay. Throughout the 20th century until the last couple of decades, people were able to get by with as little as an eighth grade education. In the 21st century, it takes some college to get by, and there is an ever-growing proportion obtaining graduate degrees. And there you go. I mean, in the old days, as a matter of fact, when I graduated from high school, almost everybody in my high school class went right into the factory. I lived in Indiana. Indiana has a lot of industry, especially automobile industry is really strong there. Chevrolet factories, Guide Lamp, Delco Battery, uh, Chrysler. Ford's not there, they're up in Detroit. But Chrysler built cars all over Indiana, uh, as did General Motors. There was a Chevrolet plant in Muncie. There was a Chrysler plant in Kokomo. There's just all of these factories. And that was really good money. I mean, it was much better money. They made a lot more money than I did. And they didn't have a college education. I spent my money on a college education. They spent their money. They didn't spend their money. They made money while I was spending money. And of course, that was one of the reasons that my first wife and I split, is because she wanted me to go into the factory. I wanted to finish college, and she was always upset about that. Her father was a factory worker. My dad was a banker. Anyway, not important. Societies are always looking for scapegoats to explain problems that they don't understand. In Europe, a frequent scapegoat has been alien religions, especially Judaism. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague and other devastating diseases like leprosy swept through Europe. And so who did they blame? Who did they scapegoat? They scapegoated the Jewish people. Looking for someone to blame, Europeans began blaming the Jews for poisoning their wells. These beliefs led to pogroms in most European countries, including Germany, the Ukraine, and Russia. The pogroms erupted periodically into the 20th century, and this is a picture of a pogrom in the 1930s. They've stripped all the outer clothing off of this lady, and they are chasing her down. You can see the little boy with the stick. She's Jewish, and they're chasing her down the street. And eventually they will strip her naked and kill her. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based in part on the platform of blaming all of Germany's problems on the Jewish population. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. Because cultures evolve from their past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one important reason that cultural differences can persist across time. Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. Puritanism emphasized respect for authority and the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dream of forming a utopia would emerge only from an educated population. Philadelphia was settled by Protestant Quakers. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with a utilitarian curriculum, with medical, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community or financial support from the Quaker culture, as it had little trust in higher education. The Puritans built Harvard University, using a liberal arts curriculum that emphasized community service. The university received tremendous community and financial support and is today the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States at $32.9 billion. The number of political leaders coming out of Harvard has been strong from its founding until today. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism, the Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. Philadelphia's culture has remained distrustful of authority and hard to govern, yet tolerant of diversity. And this is Will Smith, of course. Will Smith is from Philadelphia. Bill Cosby's from Philadelphia. It is just a far more diverse culture. Be quiet. Sorry, that's my dog. One of my dogs. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by Puritans and Quakers, respectively. Hence, the cities have been able to maintain the cultural traditions of their forebears. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what people tell us or our observations of how they behave. Pluralistic ignorance is the tendency for people to collectively misinterpret the thoughts that underlie other people's behavior. All these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on, and they're all thinking exactly the same thing. A good example of pluralistic ignorance was divulged in the studies done looking at the German people after World War II by Hannah Arendt in 1964. Arendt determined that Nazism was not followed because the German people were evil. It was followed because they were thoughtless and conforming. And so it's easy not to think. Now, this is kind of an interesting picture because there's only one guy in this picture who isn't saluting. And that, of course, is the Fascist Salute. And a lot of people just did it because everybody else was doing it. They were thoughtless and conforming. Not him. Of course, he ended up dead. He ended up in jail, and then he was executed. And that's the end of the lecture. Okay, so there you go. I will talk to you next week about something else more fun. I won't brag about my grandfather anymore. Even though he hated education, he thought it was worthless. My dad, of course, very much believed in education and sent all of his children, or tried to anyway, sent all of his children to college.